were discussing the three models in the last class, trying to reconcile questions of democracy and meritocracy. I guess that's what we were looking at, right? And the idea was to now sort of move forward. Just let me share my screen to how reform worked in China, which is a text by Weiqian. So what I wanted us to do first was to sort of divide particular sections of this text um, for everyone to be able to look at one aspect, which was very critical. And that would help us sort of discuss that over before we look at the sort of broader macroeconomic position of the Chinese economy. Um, I don't know if some of you read this particular platform called Project Syndicate. Has anybody reads this, or has anybody heard of this? No. Okay. Mm, not me. Okay. All right. Yeah, I'm sharing a link of this. I mean, this is as students of international development, I mean, apart from just reading The Economist or platforms, you'd find this platform quite interesting. It basically has commentaries from some of the most leading scholars. Just a second. Who write on contemporary political economy issues. And most of the writings are very accessible. The reason I mention of this is because for those interested in keeping up to date with just world affairs and issues around country specific scenarios which are of global importance, you have very accessible pieces that tend to come out from here. And I mean, from Joseph Stiglitz to almost every leading thinker in their own field, Robert Schiller, Michael Spence, Asimoglu, everyone who's been sort of looking at issues around sustainability, AI, trade, uh, you get a very good sort of a reference point to read. I think you do require some form of subscription to this, but it's totally worth it if some of you are interested. You can read one or two sample articles and get a sense. Reason I mention is because a lot of the sort of larger questions with respect to the economy, with respect to China, that we at least discuss in a more nutshell, have emerged from writings that have over the last few years been written on the Chinese context across different publications within Project Syndicate, just to get a sense of how. So one of the very interesting issues with China is that you can't just rely on government data um, as your sole analytical point. You have to have an intersectional reading of many aspects of what's going on in the country, um, by just not looking at the numbers, but also the implications of various policies on other aspects where China is interconnected. So to give you an example, China invests heavily through outward foreign direct investment in different African countries. So if you were to just look at net outward foreign direct investment data, which is amount of investment going out of China to specific countries, you do get the numbers of where and how that volume of investment is going. But over the years, how and where is that investment spent? You have to see it in context to the countries where that money has been invested. So you want to see, for example, how much of money has Mozambique or Ethiopia or Ghana, for that matter, has received from China, and which sectors has that money gone in, whether it's energy, whether it's um, sort of non-renewable sources of power production, whatever that may be. Is it more on resource extraction? So that aspect actually comes clearer by looking at the context of those countries itself. We'll not get that picture from the macroeconomic data. So yeah, so that's pretty interesting. So I think the platforms like these give you a very good summative reference. All right, let me just move on to the specific reading for our discussion today. I think it's, of course, the last sort of class reading that you'll be all going through. The next class is more or less reserved for the simulation exercise. And so, yeah, I mean, if you look at this particular text and if you're able to sort of just have it in front of you, I want to sort of divide this text into four particular sections where discussions on the post-reform growth trajectory of the Chinese economy are discussed. And the first is the most critical of those, which is the perspective on institutional reform. There's a very interesting dialogue that Kian provides at the initial part of the paper, which discusses the meaning and reference of what he calls and defines as transitional institutions. He defines transitional institutions as those who distinguish between achieving what is desirable versus what is feasible and go through the route of the feasibility question and avoid the sort of menu perspective of quote unquote good institutions should demonstrate. So in much of the case of China's reform trajectory, the adoption or the practice of using transitional institutions, those where not, you don't see a abject structural reform, but reform enough to achieve certain specific goals. And the achievement or realization of those goals are what you need at that time, and that just make things work. There is a term which is used in India for this, which is jugaad. Jugaad is a term which is now, I must sort of write this and um, see if I can get. Yeah, I'm sharing this for those who might be interested in this. So it's a sort of a very indigenous problem solving approach, which is very unique to the local context of the country. This is widely how a lot of things are fixed in many parts of India, whether it's an electronic equipment gone bust or a medical problem for which you need a solution. And there is a inexpensive innovation of a frugal concept, which is encouraged, and Jugaad sort of tends to be the way a lot of things are understood. In a very similar light, the Chinese sort of example of institutional reform tries to apply its own indigenous measure of problem solving or goal realization. And Kian talks about this in the first section of the paper. The second section gives you an example of a specific intervention. I think this is very critical. It talks about the dual track approach to liberalization. Uh, it focuses itself on how market adoption was done while being conscious of state provision in cases of many different industries and sectors. And while there was an opening up of certain sectors to market change, it was also seen that state provision to take care of low-income communities for access to goods, services, price adjustment was maintained. I mean, this is completely sort of traditional or non-mainstream in every possible way. There is no particular example of countries uh, approaching institutional reform, taking both tracks at the same time. It's either one or the other. So it's an interesting way of how it is applied in the Chinese economy across sectors in the 1980s in particular. The third and the fourth are again institutional references which are very non-conventional. The third one talks about how rural governments. So, in fact, the example of what you find of the third kind of model, which is the vertical model, which we were discussing in the last class, the example of that really comes through the TVE's context here. The township village enterprises were adopting what would be seen as private management firm techniques to provide public goods in a manner that local feedback loop from the citizens would be respected in ensuring delivery of those goods, and the enterprises would be given contracts based on just provisioning of those goods and services. As you read through, you get a better perspective, but they did not have any revenue generating powers. That was much so with the government. So it's efficiency maximization at the cost of uh, profit substitution in a certain sense, which is the goal of profit maximization, which is very essential to private firm establishment was is not what TVEs had, but they had everything else going for them, which a private entity or a firm would have in terms of just providing or provisioning for goods and services. It would be in case of provision of housing, sanitation, all of many critical municipal good services. Not everything, of course, went right with the TVEs. There are a lot of issues around the contracting system between the state and TVEs, which led to abject and blatant corruption. And there are examples of those which maybe Kian doesn't talk about here, but it's well known in the Chinese context. But overall, net, it was seen as a rapidly dynamic and transformative way of reimagining rural governance. Um, the Indian Minister for Rural and Parliamentary Affairs in the early 90s went and took a visit to China and wrote a whole paper on China's rural governance reform. I'm trying to see if I can. Yeah, I don't think yeah. I'll see if I can pull that out somewhere. So this was an Indian minister who made a visit to China to understand how it was in its rural governance architecture able to achieve so many rapid changes in terms of provisional of healthcare, education, sanitation, a lot of those facilities in a very short period of time, less than a decade. And he came back with a lot of insights on how the Indian context could align its efficiency first sort of model towards that of China. And I think there are a lot of lessons to be learned. Again, TVEs, much like the dual track approach, took measures which were very different and non-conventional, non-mainstream in its institutional trajectory. They have so far been very effective. One of the recent examples of TV is being more or less successful was in context to the pollution problem which Beijing had, and within a matter of 5 years, Beijing was sort of back in the scheme of things, cutting down on air pollution. It was one of the most polluted capitals, top three up until 10 years back, and it's nowhere in the list now. And one of the reasons was of just sort of invoking these institutional sort of models to get things done, a relatively short period of time. And it's not all the state at the time of, so it's not, you do see the state as a key anchor, but the provisioning or functioning or managerial aspect of much of these things are handled by entities which are not strictly, in a sense, they're state regulated, but not in many cases state owned. The last, I think, section deals with the question of fiscal federalism. Again, a very interesting way of how resource sharing between the central party and the provincial governments have happened. It's a big political issue, as you might understand, even in Canada, which is provinces which are doing very well in terms of their economic light and how much they contribute and how much they receive in terms of the federal polity. It's a big issue in India, but China sort of has managed that reasonably in an effective sense, also because of the reason that it's one single party which is at the center and also provincial level. But there's a lot of times there are a lot of disputes with resource sharing, but they came up with ways on how you can productively allocate resources. And a lot of that money would come to TVEs for ensuring some form of allocation of basic quasi-public goods from education, healthcare, housing, things like that. So resources would be made available for that targeted projects and would be utilized for that purpose. Any fund left over would be later utilized for by other province. So there was no sort of revenue income maximization or profit maximization that any of these entities would have. These are the four sections in which much of the paper by Kian is divided. If one was to look at the entire paper, you can't do that in 30 minutes or 40 minutes. So what we'll do is we'll look at different sections. You might as well sort of look at a specific section which talks about one particular um, example of an institutional reform which China undertook. This is all in the post-78 period, much so implemented in the 1980s and early 90s, and talk about that in reflection to how China was able to sort of transition itself from a low-income country to one of the fastest growing and then economies in the world. Um, so let me first, so for those, everyone, if you could just quickly raise your hand if you have the text with you. I think I've shared this with you in your chat box. Yes. Yes. So yeah, that was the first. Okay. So if you could, all those who have access to the text. So I'm going to just TPEs fiscal effect. Great. Okay. So you don't necessarily, I'm going to just speak of specific sections which a group of you are reading, but you don't have to divide anything or work in a team or anything. It's just to make things more effective from a reading standpoint. So you don't have to coordinate on anything at all. But the names I call out, just make sure that you're uh, sort of reading that particular section of the paper. So on transitional institutions, I'm going to ask Carl, uh, Jonathan, um, Merilius, and Katie. And Vikram. So just the five of you. Again, as I said, no, you don't have to work on anything as a group. I'm just speaking of names who look at specific sections of the text. Make things a little easier in the time we have. Carl, Jonathan, Merilius, Katie, and Ikram. So you're looking at the first section, which is the transitional institutions part, the first few pages. Everybody needs to read the introduction of the paper and then focus on each of these sections. Okay. Steph, on the second section, which is on talking about dual track reforms. There's Laura. Look at the dual track approach to reform. For TVEs, I'm going to ask Peter, Louise, and Elisenda, and Asia. So the four of you looking at the township village enterprises, the third section, which is mentioned here. Yeah, Charlie on fiscal federalism. I'm just Marta and Mary Pat. In fact, Mary Pat, you could look at the TVEs section actually. Township Village Enterprises 1. And Louise, you could look at the fiscal federalism section. So Charlie, Marta, Louise on fiscal federalism. Anyone else who I've missed? Is it Mackenzie? Yeah. Okay. Anyone else who I've missed by any chance, whose name I have not taken? Okay, so I'm just putting the names right here in the chat box. As I said, you don't have to coordinate on anything as a team or a group. This is just to enable a more sort of swifter way of going through certain sections of the paper. It would be better if all of you read the introduction first and then move on to reading particular sections. Introduction will give you a sort of an overarching perspective. This paper was also something which led to a larger book that Kian wrote on how reform worked in China. So the laying out of that is, I think, pretty effective in this text. So just look at these sections and then it would make things a little easier for our deliberation on these. Yeah. Okay, we'll get started. Could just take a minute to sort of collate any observations, notes you might have taken during the reading of the text. There might be particular sections or things you might want to ask, inquire. So we'll start with the first section. What in your way on your or in your reading could you interpret by the reference made to this term, transitional institutions? Start from here. Mhm. What is the author referring to by this term, transitional institutions? What do you understand by that? Mhm. Mhm. Yes, Ikram. Yeah.
So I thought this part of the text is very interesting, as it explained how China uh, were successful in their reform because they did not necessarily copy the Western development model and institutions. They were able to be creative with their transitional institutions, as in transition towards reform, which economists were struggling to understand because it did not follow their usual best practices, if you want, in democracy and so on. So in the 90s, the dominant transition orthodoxy was built around assumption grounded in experiences coming from the Eastern Europe and Latin America. So the logic was simple. You could not have markets without democracy and securing property rights. So China did things very differently because they used their political system, the authoritarian political system, and these transitional institutions to implement the reform. So the Communist Party did not give up control, as economists would recommend. On the contrary, they kept the control, and they selectively experimented with market elements. So what emerged was not a transition to capitalism as we normally see, but rather kind of a hybrid system where you have capitalism and authoritarian power.
Yeah, so one very interesting point that you made, and also I think what the author here talks about, is the conceptual outlook of these form of institutions that became interest compatible with those in power. That is, the CCP not sort of losing control of what they would want to ensure and manage within the institutional direction form, but also make them extremely goal-driven and efficiency maximizing as much as possible. The examples are laid out, I think, in the way TVEs were, for example, conceptualized much later. At the same time, the inability for the Chinese government to adopt, let's say, private property rights, a big question, made private capital to not come into China as much as it would have wanted to. And that's perhaps one of the major flailings of what transitional institutions weren't able to achieve. But at the time, particularly in the 1980s, early 1980s, they gave a new perspective on institutional reform, on what was most desirable at that time and how it could feasibly be achieved. And they got much of those sort of changes done. I think there was a need of a track two form of reform that many of the institutions required, with, let's say, the adoption of private property rights, or giving the private sort of sector more space to grow across sectors, which I think the anticipation was that somewhere around mid-1990s or the late 1990s could have been a good step in that regard, or early 2000s for that matter. And that we didn't see. There's a very similar, not in the sense of the exact one-to-one alike, but there's a similar congruent dynamic relationship with the inability of another country not able to take track two reforms seriously in case of land, labor, capital markets, in that sense, which has been India. India reformed for opening itself up to the international market early 90s. I keep coming back to these two countries because they're at the meat of the course in larger discussions. Both offer very unique experiments with approaches to growth and developmental trajectories, but both have been extremely divergent in actual performance. But in China's case, I think the inability of them to to undertake track two reforms did not deter them to make the larger leap of faith in causing or realizing change in the first step, which was to sort of move away from abject poverty, ensure access to basic resources, employment opportunities for its people, things like those. And I think that transitional institutions achieved quite succinctly at the time. Asya, please go ahead. Yeah.
Thank you. Yes, just in terms of the transitional institutions, they were responding as indicated in the paper to local economic conditions. And so at first, I was thinking, oh, sort of like municipal governments that we have, but not really because they were able to and this is, this in chapter 4, when reading about TVEs, they were able to actually, have budget and
Yeah.
management. So even though, centrally there was control, but this, soft, a much more softer way of them responding to communities locally was probably very efficient, especially in such a large country with a huge population. So that model of, somewhat decentralized, but also having, central power probably worked beautifully. And maybe that is something that has hindered the Indian economy.
Yeah. Yeah.
Anyway,
You're
those were
right.
just my thoughts. Thank you.
Yeah, you're right. You're absolutely right. I think, in fact, the reference I gave to the minister's example was precisely this, because he mentioned that there's this decentralization in political authority, but not in actual operative or functional sense. States in India still control a lot of the implementation cycle, which ideally should not be the case, because you have states and then you have municipal and panchayati Raj governments, which are at the village level. And none of these have been able to, in more or less decentralized terms, except very few states. I mean, if you look at the southern states of Kerala, Tamil Nadu for that matter, they give you examples of decentralized governance working more efficiently. But there's a history of social and political mobilization, which is sort of contributing to that. China's case is more bottom up and top down at the same time, by enabling the um, design of institutional interventions which made realization. So here is the thing which I think needs to be put in perspective. The nature of macro and micro institutional reform in China's context was extremely goal driven, and the temporality of those goals were mixed between short, medium term at best. We're not looking at long term as in 15, 20 years down the line. And that makes immediate realization of those short-term goals or medium-term goals much more effective. And you see the change of that happening in a relatively short period of time. I gave the example of air pollution or combating air pollution. China came up with a master sort of urbanization plan for Beijing. It knew which industries it wants to cut off, where it wants to displace or relocate them without hurting the economy as much. Have like a 4, 3, 5, 7 year sort of a plan. The kind of planning that you're doing as countries, in fact, given in the SDG exercise, right, which you're seeing in your simulation, the Chinese economic and political planning system works a lot like that. They think in terms of 2, 3, and 5 year timelines, and then realize, okay, what needs to be done in that order. Now, to their advantage, with a single party system, much of the effectiveness of implementation is driven by that party alone. But as you rightly pointed out, and as the author has also said, for a large country like China to achieve that within the prescribed timeline is remarkable. I think perhaps the only country in 20th century which could eradicate absolute poverty within a generation at that space. I want to move to the second point, which I think talks about the first intervention of that transitional institutional reform, which is to create a dual track approach. This is not sort of pro market in its entirety, but it's at the same time not representing an absolute what socialist state-owned and state-driven economy as well. It has a hybrid structure that works to its effectiveness, to borrow what Ikram was saying. So how do we interpret these dual track approach? Yes, Steph, please go ahead.
I can give like a brief summary of the paragraph, but then I had a question about the paragraph for you, if you don't mind.
Yeah, of course.
So a brief summary, basically the text, that portion of the text talked about how China employed basically a dual track system to market liberalization. There was the plan track where various economic agents, or essentially all economic agents, had to fulfill assigned rights and obligations for fixed quantities of goods at fixed prices. And then once those quotas or obligations were achieved, the economic agents could graduate to the market track where they could participate in the market at free market prices, provided they continued to fulfill the obligations under the plan track, if I understood that correctly. And the plan track was pretty cool, I guess, because it was efficient. It used existing market information like existing rents and enforced the plan through existing institutions. So it was pretty efficient, and it worked quite well at protecting many of the economic agents against the larger consequences of abrupt market liberalization. My question, however, is towards the end of the section, it states that labor market development followed a similar dual track system. So my question is, I can see how the system works when it comes to the like businesses participating in an economy, but I'm wondering how the dual track system works when it comes to labor market participation.
Oh, I think in the labor market context, that would not be seen in that sense effectively. And that's been a problem with wages are not representative. I mean, I think this is a concern in most worker surplus economies. Your wages, as much as possible, you think would represent market wage structures, do not really do so. And I think the dynamism of that is represented by sort of a supply curve, which is very which allows substitution for basic skill sets to happen very quickly. And there are a number of factors that goes into wage determination. The way the dual track approach is explained here, and I'll just sort of give one example, is think and imagine in terms of a farmer who under the state procured and planned track was given, let's say, $10 for producing 100 kgs of onion, and the minimum of that $10 price ensured that there is some price procured by the farmer for the sale of that 100 kgs of the first 100 kgs of produce that he or she has and sells to the state. The state buys that produce from the farmer. In some cases, and in most cases, it buffers that stock because it wants to avoid seasonality of price increase for onions and release them as and when it wants, or proportionate some part of that stock to the extreme low income citizenry, whatever that purpose might be. But the state procures that 100 kgs of onions from the farmer at $10, right? That's the minimum price that the farmer would get. And the incentive what the farmer would have is, well, if I'm not able to sell this anywhere, I have at least $10 being given for every 100 kgs of onion that I'm producing and selling. Now, the dual track approach, the way it worked was what the state promised and ensured is that after every 100 kgs of onion you produce and want to sell, we'll let you do that at the market price. So let's say the market price would be somewhere around $15 to $16 for the next 100 or 50 kgs of onion beyond the first 100 that it has already been sold to the state. So the marginal increase in production would be rewarded by giving you the market price. That's how the state, in other sense, incentivize the farmer to maximize his or her production patterns. Now, what it did was it ensured two things. The farmer would have a minimum price so that there is some basic incentive for them to get the price that they would want to restore. But it also gave the farmer the opportunity to sell a particular or to produce more than the 100 kg plant track quantity, to sell any extra quantity of that onions at the market price. Now, this maximized, of course, the cultivable productivity of farmer resources. The same reference was used in the iron and steel industry for producers to maximize production capacity. Now, at the same time, what the state did very interestingly was invest in market infrastructure, because you need market infrastructure for the producer to be able to sell what he or she is getting in the market, right? Otherwise, just saying that we will give you the benefit of selling over and above anything which is 100 kgs of onion at the market price doesn't make sense. You need some kind of market access through infrastructural development as well. You need mobility, you need transport, you need creation of new markets as physical spaces for trade. So those kind of things were enabled by the state, but all of that was done over and above the plant track procurement. So this is what the dual track approach means. It was done more or less at the level of price margin liberalization, which is the margin of price that you would get under the plant track and what you can possibly get under the market track. So, Steph, to answer the question, this is more representative of the price and the changes in price, less so in the wage structure. But it might be interesting, I mean, to just, and I can probably look this up, whether there was some element of distinction drawn between a market wage versus a state minimum wage, which was drawn under this track. I'll have to look up some of the references for that. But in my limited knowledge of this, on wages, there was not much done. The idea at that time for the people at large was to get a minimum price. At the same time, a job that would ensure that you have some wage as against no job situation. Because if you understand, I think much of the economy and the citizenry at the time were coming from positions of extreme vulnerability, of being absorbed in the agricultural sector. 60 to 70% of the Chinese population by late 70s were mostly in agricultural sector. Very few were working in the industrial sector. So a lot of that structural transformation in the workforce happened as industry started growing. And 1980s is that decade of change for the economy as a whole. So of course, you would see that wages would change, but not as a result of a conscious step taken by the state at large, but more so as a result of the changing nature of job. I don't know if everybody sort of followed this example. Yeah, sorry.
No, I
Go
was
ahead.
just gonna say that makes sense.
Yeah. Anyone else who could follow and understand? If I could just see a raise of hands. So if you could understand the example of the farmer versus the industrial context of producing something at a plant track, which is at a minimum price, and then giving the benefit of someone to produce at a larger quantity over and above that, which they can sell at the market price, which will be much more than what they were getting at the plant price. Okay, so let me move on with that to the third point on TVEs, Township Village Enterprises. Any observations in this particular section based on what you would have read? Yeah, Peter.
Yeah, so it was talking about how, I mean, one of the biggest like sort of mysteries of the Chinese context is the fact that the country managed to develop despite strong private property rights, because typically, if you don't have private property rights, people aren't incentivized to engage in productive investment because they fear that the returns of that investment will be expropriated by the state. So township and village enterprises were a way of sort of getting around that because they were useful to the national government both politically and economically. And so they were unlikely to, unjustly take their assets, and they're left relatively alone. And they were useful to the national government because, for one thing, they were a more effective way of securing tax revenue. Because since the local government had direct control over those returns, it was, there wasn't tax evasion going on the way that there would be with private enterprises. And then also because um, the way that private enterprises would try to evade taxes, in part, would lead to them mainly engaging like short-term projects and like very liquid projects, which would mean like very little infrastructural development. So, because that problem was avoided, the TVs were capable of engaging that infrastructural development, which made them politically useful for the national government as well.
Okay, wonderful. I want to sort of bring points from the fourth section as well into this, because some of the discussions within TVEs is also drawn from how the federal relationship in fiscal sharing or distribution of resources was managed. It's closely tied in the way how TVEs were regulated in a relatively more decentralized manner. Any observations on point 4, which is reforming the government and productive fiscal federalism? How does the fiscal partnership work? Yeah. Okay. Yes, Charlie, please. I was about to say that.
So I think the idea in that relationship was that the state and the regional governments would, where originally the state was taking the lion's share of revenue that was brought in from, regionally, there was a decision made that in fact the best option to encourage continued economic growth locally would be for the regional government to maintain the majority of that revenue in order to then reinvest it back into the region, which they saw it as an opportunity to increase revenue rather than when any income was shipped off to the centralized government. There was limited opportunity. There was limited incentive regionally to increase revenue, and one of the reasons that one of the interesting comparisons that was done there was they talked about how China followed this model of prioritizing regional, keeping the money regionally, whereas Russia did not. And you could see Russia had kept the idea that the money should be sent off to the state. And in that situation, Chinese regional governments saw huge increases in their revenue, while Russian ones did not, because they just lacked the incentive to, if the money wasn't staying local, then there was no incentive to continue to innovate and industrialize.
Okay, excellent. Any other thoughts, reflections on this particular section or on TVs? Anything that was interesting that you came across? I mean, both of these are actually very unique to China's both political economy model. Is that unique that you cannot probably adopt this and adapt to this in any other setting? Because it's been often cited, and it within the East Asian economies, it's been argued that China's sort of economic transformation, as enviable as it is, can be replicated and brought forth in many other countries, or those resembling with similar features. But the short answer to that is that it's not really possible. And the way to explain that is not, the answer to that is not purely in economic terms. There are a lot of socio-political and sociocultural factors contributing for the nature of political economy change that is possible. I want to quickly take the sort of the next few minutes to run through some critical data points. And again, all of these are largely in context to how the economy has been functioning prior to the pandemic, and how China has been looking at sectoral change in terms of its growth composition. China is no longer growing as a manufacturing powerhouse. The change started much so from the 2007 crisis, where its exports were badly hit in manufacturing driven sector linkages. It worsened, I think, over the years, but the state was also aware that a lot of its manufacturing capacity was conditional upon workforce participation rate in the productive workforce age category. And with an aging economy and an aging demographic, that may not be the sort of long-term way. And it started moving a lot towards harnessing its service sector. And you see examples of that right from 2012 and 13, where the service sector started in value-added terms contributing more to the GDP as compared to what the manufacturing sector was doing. You have the position of trade no longer dictating the majority of the growth composition. To a lot of people, when these data points are initially shown, I think this comes as a surprise, because for most people, China's sort of economic recession is being observed as something which is recent, accentuated by the pandemic or the nature of lockdowns that were imposed. But the trends around those lines were starting very much from 2017-18 onwards. In fact, one of the critical things to recognize with the nature of growth in China's sort of last decade economic growth landscape is that it never fully recovered to the pre-2007 period, after the economic crisis of 2008. Its sort of structural composition of growth changed gradually. It was no longer sort of contributing to the world's supply of different manufacturing and consumer goods at the same level. Yes, it continued to be the world's sort of factory workshop for manufacturing goods and luxury goods and many of those, but its revenue margins had started taking a hit. And I think somewhere this was something that I remember, I think, visiting Beijing and being part of some discussions around uh, growth models comparatively of across countries. And it was quite well established and acknowledged that China's sort of comparative advantage in manufacturing was not a long-term sustainable picture, and they had to sort of diversify into various services. So a huge and enormous investment in R&D, in tech, and advancement of that across different services was essential. There is a set of other data points, and I think in relational terms to what we were looking at the Indian story, this might be particularly helpful. You might find employment in services to pick up, which it started doing in the last sort of 10, 15 years. It was marginal, but I think the numbers now are more than 55 to 60%. At the same time, vulnerable employment, which is employment without social security benefits, things like that, drastically came down. As I don't know if you'd recall, but the Indian context is 80% of our employment is still in the vulnerable category, and that has been a big area of change that the Chinese economy experienced, particularly from the 90s. I think this is a big area, and which requires, I think, further scrutiny. It's one of the few countries in the emerging developing markets that have been able to combat and reduce its out-of-pocket healthcare expenditure. So for every $100 spent in healthcare in India, 60 of those dollars are coming from out-of-pocket on an average. And in cases of the informal economy, almost 85 to $90 is being spent out of pocket, because you don't have insurance, you don't have access to healthcare security. But I think this is one big area where China has sort of invested, both in terms of access and also on expenditure, in ensuring more and more of its workers and people of getting access to health services. In fact, I think within every I think 1 to 3 kilometer radius, you have a medical facility which is immediately there to provide care in case anybody needs that, in terms of one working as a primary and secondary healthcare service provider, and then you have sort of district or larger hospital-based networks functioning. That's been almost no less than, in terms of its overall infrastructural growth, health infrastructural growth, transformative and revolutionary. Even in fact, if you were to go to an average Chinese mall, it would have a certain space reserved for a healthcare facility, which is there as a matter of practice. So it's part of, as we see in municipal zoning laws, where you have construction permits given with some conditions of green space cover, affordable housing projects, things like that. I think in their case, they've done that with an inclusion of healthcare infrastructure also, and that's been a big factor for um, causing positive change in human development performance. I mean, there's much to unpack within the female to male labor force story in the Chinese context. But on average, more women are part of the organized workforce in China as compared to the Indian story. We've sort of broken down the numbers in the Indian story. Except health and education, all other sectors have a large male to female labor force participation composition. In the China sort of model and context, you don't see that to be the case. However, there are very few participation of women at the top of the employer or entrepreneurial composition level. And that's been one of the major, I think, factors in China's own story, which is a lot of the women have not been at the level of entrepreneurs driving businesses or at leadership level roles. And somewhere I think that has been a critical factor, which, I mean, this is something which is acknowledged, but I don't think there have been active interventions made in that regard to promote more women leadership across sectors. And it also, there's a lot of class composition that needs to be also kept in mind. Yes, Francia? Yeah. Sorry.
Yeah, good morning. I just wanted to, because I mean, talking about healthcare and so on, it just seems very positive, but with China being such a big country, right? One cannot deny that there is disparities when it comes to, the distribution of federal government money. So with that being said, for instance, and the fragmented fiscal federalism, right? So what that means is, in a way, is that wealthier regions get better healthcare, finance hospitals and clinics. And so the poorer regions, and we hear about this often in rural China, and that's why, a lot of people are moving to the cities again, which is kind of because of a common effect or whatnot. They're underfunded. And so healthcare, in a way, I think it has become like, and we see this trend now in Canada, and we see, and it's in the US, of course, but the healthcare provision has become increasingly marketized because of this. And so it does leave certain communities, especially in the rural areas, you know what I mean? It leaves them off of that great healthcare. And so I don't think everything is perfect. I think they obviously have improved as their wealth growth, and they're looking for ways, but I don't think it's that great still in the rural areas, remote areas of China.
Any particular areas you have in mind when you say that?
No, I wouldn't be able to like pinpoint a region at the moment, given that China is China's a massive country.
Yeah.
So in a way, it is a given that remote areas will suffer from, lack of funding. And that's also a trend we see everywhere, to be honest. But
Yeah.
I just want to bring that criticism to attention.
Respond to that. So I think, see, it's important to put into perspective what we're discussing here. I think the discussion here is to compare where China was in its sort of 1960s and 70s versus what it saw in the 80s and 90s. And what it has seen in 90s and 2000s compared to where things are today. I think the decadal shift in its, let me like use, for example, one area, which is access to basic healthcare. To an average Chinese citizen in the 1960s, 70s, to find basic healthcare access, it would be extremely difficult for state provision to ensure of that. And in fact, millions and millions of people died as a result of the kind of policies Mao had, by exporting food grains in exchange of purely what would be seen as guns for military enhancement. 1970s and sort of the Deng Xiaoping post period started seeing certain degrees of change because CCP actually felt it would no longer be able to sustain being in power, and given there was a huge public resentment against the CCP and its inability to ensure and cause social, economic, and political change for the good of the people. And 80s and 90s became that sort of period for change to be realized. So if you were to compare the decades prior to that versus what you see thereafter, I mean, I'm using both experience from having spent a little bit of time traveling in different provincial networks versus seeing what the macro picture shows, and those who have studied a lot of time or spent a lot of time in China, what they've written on China, and which is why I was giving you the reference initially in the class to Project Syndicate and the writings on China as well. So if you collate those observations, there is no doubt. In fact, there is no comparison between the American and the Chinese story. China is much more in terms of access to basic healthcare and treatment. You have your accessibility markers taken care of at the very sort of decentralized level across most regions. I mean, barring a few villages or village-based clusters or some specific provincial network, which is, of course, likely to be the case in a country of more than 1.2, 1.3 billion people. Overall, net accessibility has not been a major concern. In fact, had that been a big problem, China's sort of post-pandemic economy would have exposed those glaring sort of inconsistencies, even if there was a larger propaganda in effect, that for an outsider to say that, oh, everything is sort of all well. And the local, so there are two things that in observation that you're making, and the point, and I think it's critical to recognize that, yeah, there are always issues that you could have with healthcare in terms of which level of healthcare treatment you're talking about, secondary and tertiary healthcare. Tertiary healthcare is a challenge in most emerging market economies, not just China, but in most of the areas. And you need upward mobility. You need people to go to the cities to get certain kind of more sophisticated treatments done. And that in that context and regard, you would find that they've ensured for that. Net workers have been able to also access that. To my surprise, where I find the China stories to be remarkable is what it has done in terms of ensuring even access to basic medical treatment to low-income migrant workers. I mean, workers migrating from rural areas to urban areas for construction work, who otherwise do not enjoy many rights, access to resources, and even their basic healthcare needs are taken care of. And in the Indian context, almost 95% of that low income migrant category would not be even having any healthcare access. I mean, for women to even get a day off would result in, independent of whatever reasons, it could be health reasons or anything, you would lose that day's wage. And there was a group of civil society workers in the Chinese context which worked very closely with the state to ensure that migrant workers who were moving between rural and urban areas, and The mobility was less as a result of lack of access to healthcare or education, but more in terms of getting better economic opportunity. So I think the motivations of migrations have to be also looked at and studied. So in China's context, it has been more, much like Vietnam or, for example, any other country, that the rural to urban migration is a story of greater economic opportunity and change as you're moving up the sort of ladder. And that's structural transformation, not as a result of a lack of choice. Of course, a rural area would not have facilities that you would expect from what you would see in cities, which are more urbanized and better equipped. But in terms of basic healthcare access, I mean, I'm not saying everything is perfect, not that claim is being made here, but the transition and the transformation in those decades is remarkable. I can't think of any other story. Maybe Brazil to a certain extent, but Brazil had a huge problem with inequality of access to resources. So you'd have favelas where people with in slum-based networks would have very basic limited access versus those in gated communities who could get access to healthcare and better education as needed. But there is a certain degree of egalitarianism in terms of access to basic resources, and that's almost enviable with any other emerging market economy. So I'll take, as much as I'm very critical about the Chinese story, I think on healthcare and access to basic human sort of capability enhancers, there is no comparison. I don't think of any other country which comes too closely in mind. There is a path dependency, and I wanted to sort of come to that in a bit. Is there's a path dependent relationship. China did not do this in isolation. They studied, and their sort of policy advisors studied alternative economic models to realize this. And a lot of what it followed, a lot of what the state followed was consistent with some other states that it studied. And for a lot of people who may be aware of this, but not in that context, uh, factually consistent, what the data might see is China's sort of resemblance to two countries in its ability to ensure economic change and transformation. That was Japan and South Korea. You have data points, not just in growth, but also in terms of developmental indicators, which resemble the 1960s Japan with 1980s China. And China was making a lot of its change in realizing how state-built and state-owned and state-driven models had been seen to be more effective in other East Asian economies. And it saw that Japan was able to do that and achieve that in a relatively short period of time across decades, and it wanted to sort of implicate or replicate those things as well. There is, however, a concern, and I think to be sensitive and sympathetic to what Francia you're saying, is the fact that on ethnic minorities and concerns of access to basic resources for those communities, that's being a big issue. It's a political issue, it's an economic issue, it's a social issue where minority populations in the Chinese context, you could start with looking at Tibetans, you could start looking at other Uyghurs, that is the ethnic sort of Muslim community in the context of the Chinese state. Ethnic minorities have struggled to have the same access to resources as much of the majority, the Han community. But the majority community, that is the population of the Han community, is overwhelmingly, I think, 85 to 90%. And unlike India, where there is more ethno-linguistic fragmentation, the social diversity is high. You have a minority population, which is the largest Muslim population in much of South Asia. It's for China to have sort of ignored and indifferently treated minorities did not affect its overall macro picture. But when you see that at the very localized level, it's a story worth telling. But on access to resources, clearly, I mean, it's done much better. In fact, I can sort of now say the last year I spent some time traveling Midwest and down south in the US. I would say that by looking at how the US sort of rural networks work versus how China's sort of rural network work, clearly China's sort of access to basic schooling and healthcare provisioning is much better placed in that regard. Vulnerable employment, yeah, so this was the point which I was making, that less than maybe 2% of the overall female employment includes female employers, and that's been one of the key areas of a major missing link in China's sort of gender story, where more women employers are absent from the workforce, versus there is a higher participation, of course, of women across different sectors, and you find that in other East Asian economies as well. Yeah, I mean, poverty eradication is often spoken in context to how China's sort of transformation was seen. At least absolute poverty eradication happened less than 25 years. There's perhaps no country, even including Britain during the Industrial Revolution days, we could achieve that in that short a period of time. One big other issue and area which is not captured here in data, but I think it's worth telling, is on affordable housing. China managed for much of its migrating population access to affordable housing in many of the citywide clusters, which took care of issues around rent explosion. Now, it's another story that China is facing currently a crisis of rent in much of its urban city networks. It was trying to experiment. As I remember, 6-7 years back visiting China, they were experimenting with price caps on rental sort of structures within cities, and cities like Shanghai, Beijing, and were already sort of trying to implement that. I don't know to what extent that was successful, but to the way at least the feedback on this goes is that rent is still bigger concern in their overall composition of expenses, and maybe the issue is still more pertaining, but on access to affordable housing for low income, middle income, and migrant community, I think that was very central to China's own sort of overall housing construction story. Path dependency is, I think, something which one can explore, but there are certain similarities. In some sort of major challenges, I think this overspending of government and over reliance on government spending had accentuated a lot of debt for China even before. But what's been most troubling in the last sort of few years, and this is way before the pandemic, that its corporate and household debt, as a percentage of GDP, has been growing. The current debt levels seem to be around 300% of its GDP. And that's made extra resource availability for spending, including for federal financing purposes, very difficult. This is evident in terms of the saturation of growth in many of the sort of metro areas. So the red bubbles give you an idea that there are major growth centers for much of the 80s and 90s and early 2000s, but have been growing at a much slower rate as compared to many of the other areas, that is the blue bubbles here. Again, much of this is representative of 2015-16. What has happened in the last 7 to 8 years is that the red bubbles actually have shrunk further, which is the growth have started reducing, and it has put a lot of pressure on tier 2, tier 3 towns to maximize growth potential. Now, one of the interesting thing of tier 2, tier 3 towns is that their workforce is very much aligned to manufacturing and not services. And since manufacturing has not been growing at the pace that one would have anticipated, these village and rural workforce clusters have not produced the kind of growth that China has seen otherwise. So while service sector growth is very localized within cities and big urban metropolises, the manufacturing story is one of tier 2, tier 3 towns, and that has not been able to reconcile itself. Its growth structure has sort of struggled to map the needs of where people are skilled versus where the actual growth is taking place in context to the China situation. Other sort of minor details around currency management. China was sort of infamously put across amongst many Western circles that it would sort of devaluate its currency, keep it more sort of competitive to ensure that manufacturing sector did not suffer in terms of exports. But since there has been a lower demand for much of its products over a period of time, the currency situation and in terms of its own valuation has not helped, and there have been shocks internally in its stock market, which also suddenly caused Bank of China to be taking some extreme measures in macro management of balance of payments. And a lot of the concerns with respect to the stock market or exchange rate gives or makes investors more wary. As I think a point that I've mentioned repeatedly, China doesn't receive a lot of foreign investor money into its market, but the perception that there is something wrong maybe in its domestic financial market because it is so ubiquitous may make investment coming from China more varied. Like people may be more, or countries may be more resistant to taking more Chinese capital. And that's happened. Its One Belt, One Road initiative suffered heavily as a result of skepticism of this narrative of countries importing China's debt or the debt export of China's state-owned enterprises into other countries. And what has happened is many countries, including countries in Europe like Italy, which were open to receiving China's private capital and through state-owned enterprises for infrastructural and other means, were stopped and discouraged. And at the same time, what happened was then China had to expand its relationship with much of vulnerably placed countries, let's say those which already have weak or fragile macroeconomic indicators, to partner with them. And the return on investment with partnering with those countries are already very fragile. So you have economies where without substantive growth, China has sort of partnered with them for their sort of maximizing infrastructural and other forms of outward lending. So this has been a matter of big concern for the economy at large. Its exports have not grown at the level as it did or they did till or prior 2008 and 9. That's affected their overall growth story. One of the key concerns with the issue of an export-oriented industrialized economy like South Korea was, or Taiwan has been, or Japan was, is that your entire model of growth is aligned to how well your exports are doing. Indian context has not been suffered in this regard because we've not really exported much in terms of our overall growth picture. Our growth picture is more of consumption demand, foreign capital coming inwards, and which is through inward foreign direct investment. And in the context to exports, it's only in very recent years that India is exporting more in, let's say, areas like textile, garments, and things like that. So keeping those pointers in mind, there is always a sense of skepticism. I think the inability of China to sort of undertake what you would consider our critical track to institutional reforms has, of course, circumscribed its ability to grow beyond the level it did. But that doesn't take away the fact that in less than 20-25 years, it was able to achieve goals and objectives which were completely unrecognizable for any emerging market economy of the size that China was or is. So that doesn't take the credit away for the economy of what it did. There are many issues here which Kian doesn't discuss, and I mentioned about that, or I initially introduced the text by talking about that, which is of public state or state corruption. It's a big problem in China. In fact, the relationship between TVEs and state was corrupted, or the party was corrupted, much so in terms of rampant corruption between CCP leaders and those sort of managing governance at the local level, issues with respect to generally top-down corruption as well, which has been very rampant in China's story. But the way the political system works is because there is so over-reliant interest-compatible forms of regime dominance that no matter how bad the situation might be, there is some internal remedial measure to correct for that change. Some may argue that it's sort of as much done that the CCP is like the sort of as a single party is one of the most dominant institutions. So nothing sort of breaks into the CCP in independent of what changes or issues it might be facing. So with that, I think our discussion, particularly in terms of comparing certain aspects of the India-China story, bring in light where both of the models have gone. I think one point of caution is not to compare these two civilizationally different countries, no matter how close they are in their geographical proximity, particularly in its eastern part. And in case of China, you do have examples of very different kind of institutional change, which is not to be found in the Indian story. The Indian story gives you much more reminiscence of a model similar to a certain extent of Latin America and other countries, which try to ape or replicate what the West was doing, take advice from Western institutions on internal reform, and result in certain issues of divergence in growth possibilities. Having said that, the Indian story also gives a reflection of a growth model which was very less focused on, let's say, manufacturing or industries, but more reliant on services. And its agricultural sector has been virtually left untouched. While in China's context, the structural transformation seen from agriculture to manufacturing and then now more towards trade and then services has been more or less seen across the last 25 years in continuum. So any questions or follow-up on what we have discussed might be good, or any reflections based on what you would have had as questions or doubts that might be good. I just sort of keep around 10 minutes or so for us to be able to take into consideration what we have learned from these respective country-based case studies. Before coming to these countries, you had looked at different other countries as well. And whatever that you might want to reflect based on what you see with these countries that reminds you of other examples or distinguishes itself from other examples you might know, that would be interesting to know. So let me invite any reflections or final thoughts from any one of you here. Be good to hear. Yes, Peter, please go ahead.
It's not so much a reflection on the whole session today, so much as just something that stuck with me from the reading that we did earlier, where Kian talks about sort of the two myths of Chinese development. One where it's often described as just like a product of FDI, and what was the other one? And in any case, it was interesting to me because I feel like this is a common issue within the sort of like Asian development context. Like I've read a lot about how, or just any development context that doesn't like closely follow sort of neoliberal like development, recommendations. Like I've read a lot about how like the World Bank often sort of tries to argue against the notion that the Asian tigers developed due to like state intervention, stuff like that.
Sorry, I didn't get the
So
last part. What did you
sure.
say?
I was saying I've read a lot about how like the World Bank, for example, is very reluctant to admit to the theory that for example, like the Japanese miracle was due to like state intervention in the economy and stuff like that, right?
Yeah.
So it's I don't know, it's just interesting to read about like how this
So I
the
think an
economic
interest,
orthodoxy is very strong.
yeah. The one interesting point, just borrowing from what you said, it takes us back to the Atul Kohli initial reading, if you guys would remember, on not like state intervention not being just of a factor causing for institutional change, but also looking at what kind of state intervention works and under what conditions it takes place, and looking at examples from Nigeria, India, Brazil, Korea. What Kohli was trying to give you perspectives of is that state intervention is also a very complex exercise because there is a colonial past for countries, which makes, I mean, the forces of colonialism makes any form of new institutional intervention extremely sort of difficult or resistant to not being able to sort of undo the past in a short period of time. And so in reference to India, of course, it faces that dilemma for much of its time in post-independent history. Its military and civil service institutional structure is more or less reminiscent of a colonial past. It's still, I mean, as we speak, there are amendments, changes, all of those made, but in a larger sense, the Indian administrative services is still a product of its colonial sort of British Raj structure. It's the more effective form of bureaucratic intervention, but it was designed not in a post-independent India, but done so much before. In China's context, you do see the discussion with the three models that you were looking at, this constant effort to combine forces of meritocracy, but do so in a manner that there is some kind of localized, decentralized feedback loop, which doesn't cause, and the CCP is very much aware that any top-down measures which do not take into considerations local feedback loops to be instituted may result in a revolt or a rebel amongst the so-called quote unquote rural peasant class as they experienced during the Cultural Revolution at any point of time. And as a result, its reform story has tried to develop that vertical model where there is some level of decentralized governance structure. So TVs are an example in that case in point, which is they provide for some space of functional representation of some degree of feedback of what goals are being effectively realized by TVs or not. If one TV is not able to do that, then you outbid that and bring another enterprise to execute or implement without the central party losing its control or command over the provincial network. And all of that was done keeping in mind that China needed its own institutional model for the intervention it was seeking. And in that case, it's very unique, unlike in many other countries. So I think in a mixed sort of reflective sense, institutional or state intervention that allows for many of the East Asian economies to grow takes place uniquely very different to each of the countries. I think the South Korea case is very different. It has a lot of its roots in its past from how the Meiji Restoration and the Japanese colonial state entrenched itself. And then Korea faced an ideological divide, North Korea and South Korea sort of going different paths and then resulting in completely different economic growth trajectories and development models. You see with Japan also, I mean, Japan went in the 1970s on the export-oriented industrialization route, but because it had a lot of military subservience and exposure to the US, and with the, I mean, we could have talked a lot more about Japan, but the WTO restrictions on trade with the anti-dumping laws introduced during the Tokyo round, it hit Japan in the worst possible way. In fact, a lot of people see in the international trade regime discussions that the Tokyo round was designed to take over Japan, because Japanese cars and Japanese electronics were taking over the North American and European market at the time, and were doing so in very competitive setups. China, I think, was aware of those historical lessons and somehow was able to still manage and compete with the other markets at the time of its own rise in the 90s. And in fact, its own entry into the WTO worked to its advantage, while in many other cases in the emerging market economies, it was the other way around, that their presence in the international trading system, asymmetric power dynamic between the sort of the global north and global south affected these countries in sort of more worse off ways. So I think it's a combination of those factors. The timing where I think China managed to do well was that it also provided an alternative narrative for growth and development possibilities to be realized. It's been in that sense a multilateral player. We think of China in a certain light when we talk about its domestic polity, but in international polity and matters of what you would consider as debt reduction, for considering matters of, I mean, in the post-pandemic sense of issues around climate change, climate finance, environmental, actually China has been taking the step forward as compared to many other countries. I mean, we are part of some of those discussions of, and I'm observing those negotiations, and China presents a completely different pace because it realizes itself to be one of those global leaders now. It is another case that on other matters, China's position on many issues on nuclear proliferation and factors that are different, maybe very different, but that is the case with the United States as well. United States has played that game also for many of its foreign policy outlook. So we moved from what was a unipolar to a bipolar sort of structure of the world. And then what we see now in the last sort of 10 years, very prophetically to what Professor Robert Wade, for those who are not aware of his work, but I can just write his name. He was writing on some of these issues when we were students at LSE, and a lot of times he was seen as this person who was very aggressively sort of critical of the US established dominant hierarchy of a hegemonic rule in the international financial and governance architecture. But on many points, Wade was very right. If I can probably share one of his very interesting readings, I tend to often use this in our class on international political economy, which is not the sort of focus in our course here, but it may be still of use to those. These two very interesting readings, US Hegemony and World Bank. And somewhere this was then used by China's own narrative that the US-driven institutions had a political motivation which was very different. And then, okay, just this one, and you must have received something there. Yeah, this one. So these two readings, if you get a chance, I mean, for those interested in largely the international political economy, landscape and system, you'll find this actually quite intriguing. I felt there were these readings and texts were very ahead of their time, brought into issues, I think, which were at the time was seen more as outliers to the larger debate and how well the US was sort of leading the world. But you'd find some very interesting anecdotes here, particularly the second reading, this one, which is on multilateralism without multipolarity. So yeah, I mean, thank you for those observations, Peter. Made us sort of move, and I sort of digressed a little bit. My apologies, but okay. Any other reflections, guys? Maybe this is the next 10 minutes. Yes, I do agree, Francia. But one of the issues since World War II was that there was a subtle adoption of America's sort of financial imperial agenda with the rise of the US dollar, which was seen as replacing gold as a dominant reserve currency. The Bretton Woods arrangement secured that. European countries tried very hard to develop their own sort of union, which led fundamentally up until the 90s emergence of the euro, but it did never could really become the dominant force. I think it's only in the last perhaps 10 years that there has been such an aggressive, assertive push for an alternative um, leader in world power dynamics. And to one's liking or disliking, I mean, China has emerged in that space as the country which most countries in the sort of developing global south have aligned themselves to. India's role, it has been seen, was very critical in terms of being a non-aligned actor who doesn't really take the Chinese side or the American side, and it has its own business. But India's economic might is nowhere at any point or level that China and the US commands. And the response is because of its own domestic economic inequality and situation of its own struggles. So these two countries have emerged very important. And then you have within the BRICS countries like Brazil, India, in their own regional sense, being very more strategic. So we are clearly looking and living in a very multi-aligned and multipolar sort of world order. There are these partnerships with one or two dominant anchors, but more or less it has its own sort of issues. In fact, perhaps the only period I can think of is perhaps the 1930s, where on certain issues, countries would align with one major sort of hegemonic anchor, but on other issues, it may find itself to be at odds with the same anchor and then still find themselves to be at a position of deferred alignment and coexist. Yes.
I think, yeah, I think it's very interesting that you're mentioning this, because there is is a lot about, it's become, I would say in the last 20 years or 30, has become more about alliances, where you see these big economies now wanting to participate with the smaller players and bringing them sort of under their wing. And I said that between quotes because we don't need what under the wing means sometimes. So, but especially I think, again, bringing it to the actual, like, today's date, what's happening with the US is just incredible to watch. Because if we talk about the world economic table, now that you have all these trade deals and agreements and blocks popping up because of what's happening with the US administration, you see now that the hegemonic power is weakening, right? So US is now still at the table, but it no longer controls the conversation, which is very interesting.
Yeah, no, and I mean, even the institutional architecture, which let's say the IMF or the World Bank established, or the WTO was seeking to establish as a critical dispute settlement mechanism, the absence of reforms in these institutions have made the position of many countries to be so skeptical of these institutional forms and structures, where the need for an alternative became under more pressing. It gave ways for countries like, I mean, I would say China to take that assertive position and stand. You had the New Development Bank, you had Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, all of these alternative institutional imaginations finding way to regulate many things, amongst issues of capital mobility to infrastructural lending and things like that, which earlier people relied on the World Bank. And a lot of that dissolving or dissolution of faith as a result is of the kind of conduct the US has seen itself. I mean, it was able to manage the perception of being a global unifying anchor versus having its own America's interest to be more supreme than anything else. It managed that, I think, paradoxical reality quite well in its foreign policy agenda. I mean, even Kissinger would in closed doors very clearly, astutely give a perception that America's interest nationally would override everything else in terms of critical decision making. But there was still a way in which countries would be given a sort of an appearance of a space to have a role to play. It's that I think paradoxical imaging or projection is completely lost under Trump. And what I think somewhere it is making countries to do, which is to their own advantage, is to look out in their own backyard and sort of ensure that they have the capabilities on not just matters of military self-reliance, but also an economic self-reliance. Like, I'm talking to now more and more people in Canada saying, oh, we should buy products which are made in Canada, or we should sort of boycott what we are doing with the American products coming in. I think it would be a sentiment which would be shared in some sense here as well. And so I would be saying that, well, it's not in a terribly sense, it's not bad for the Canadian consumers to do that, so that you move towards in the next 5 to 10 years into a more self-reliant economy. Otherwise, you are pegged in an economic sense, much so in terms of being dependent on what the US was doing and was not doing. I mean, from a monetary policy standpoint, you'd still remain vulnerable because you have a dollar valuation which is closely pegged to the management of the US dollar. But on many other matters, there is always a space for a policy shift. Yes, Asiya, please go ahead. Sorry.
No, I was thinking about this in the context of Pakistan and China's economic development in Pakistan. I'm always amazed every few years when I go back and I hear from family and I look around, and the amount of investments that China is making. There's the road that is, that has been created, and that has been a joint collaboration between Pakistan and China, mainly China. And then from a military perspective, they were assisting the Pakistanis during the last skirmish between India and Pakistan. And because Pakistan heavily relied post-partition on, the good graces of the United States, and that led to, a complete dismantling of, the little democracy that Pakistan was. So it's just fascinating how, these regions, these countries are looking in their backyards, and specifically to China now, to say, okay, you know what, we're going to forget about the United States and we're going to forge, different partnerships. And us in the West may look down on that and say, oh, they're 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 partnering with China. But I mean, personally, I think that is better, certainly, because partnering with the West and the United States did not fare well in South Asia or the Middle East.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And the other context to the debate in Pakistan was in the kind and the nature and volume of exposure that the country should have vis-a-vis China in terms of its infrastructural lending position. And I think this is where the internal divide between the army and the sort of civil government also was pretty clear, because the army, I think, was of the view of sort of having greater reliance on the Chinese because of its military interdependence, while I think the Imran Khan government was cautious of not having an
Yes.
excess push for the sort of dead diplomacy context which was overriding. And I think the Imran Khan government at the time was wise and prudent to understand what was really happening, because I've made that, I mean, I was writing and then I sort of stopped this in because I had a few travel visits to China and Cambodia, which is the other country I work. So you don't want to be writing just blatantly China dribble. But what happened was, because of the failures of the One Belt One Road project, which initially had a lot of European partners into the mix, and then there was this sort of rhetorical pitch on China's debt being exported and the European countries becoming extremely wary of any Chinese capital coming to these countries, Italy being a prime example, Greece and other partners. What was left then for the state-owned enterprises was to really target low middle income countries. And then there was a sudden exodus of capital push. Sri Lanka, I saw that very clearly as well. If you could just go to the Colombian port, all constructions were being done by Chinese companies, and Sri Lanka at that point virtually had no option but to go with what they saw. But I think there was some resistance. Australia did a lot of sort of campaign against that, and then other countries like Pakistan and within South Asia, I would say probably Bangladesh to a certain extent was trying to resist that heavy influx of Chinese capital. But at the end of the day, I mean, if you don't have a suitable option now, I mean, you're seeing a very different change of Trump administration's treatment of Pakistan in a sudden sort of twist of phase, because it still sees the military relationship to be critical, which was not the case for the last, I mean, at least 2 decades or 3 decades, with US sort of pivoting more towards India. So it's an interesting period of or passage of time. I mean, I would say that the last of when we saw in the late 1980s and early 90s, there was a huge international world power shift with the collapse of the Soviet Union and sort of the assertive rise of the United States. We are in somewhere a similar spot at this point of time where we're seeing a multi-polar and multi-aligned rise in power dynamics amongst countries, where regional strategic anchors would dictate much of what would happen within those regions, but would have an apex key strong power ally. Now, in some cases, for some countries, that would be China, and on some matters, China would continue playing that multilateral anchor role. And in some cases, it would be the US, or you might find a third sort of country emerging in that relationship as well. Like Russia becomes now, in some cases, important in its own light within the regional context of where it plays. So for those, I think studying even international development, those undercurrents of observed changes in power dynamics are very critical, because to give you an example, USAID funding drying up and being sort of cut out of the blue has major ramifications of aid and development assistance programs, which gave suddenly China a huge impetus to fill in that gap. And countries which are in that position of greater vulnerability, let's say in parts of West, East Africa, would take over for that aid and development assistance program money, which would come in from other countries. So it's an important and interesting time. Okay, so keeping that where it is. All right, so we're preparing ourselves for Thursday. I want to just take the last 5 to 10 minutes to invite any questions, reflections, anything that you might want to add or say, which is just in reference to Thursday, or if you have any queries or clarifications, and we are good to go then.